So yeah, I think this is a bit surprising because I realised in the car on the way over, essentially 2 years since I stood in front of an audience giving a talk. I was giving a training session at the Drupal Camp London conference just before the lockdowns all started. So whilst I've been doing a lot of remote speaking, being back in front of people again is figuring out how to do this again. It's been a little while. As Lee said, this talk, and Dave said, this talk is about things to know about PHP. This is me, and then there's a link here to a page on my website with a link with all the resources in it, so with some extras as well, so we can find out those later on. This talk is things about PHP, as we said. This is quite a different talk for me as well. Usually I give more sort of really quite technical talks and give talks on things like automated testing and static analysis and automated deployments. This isn't really a code talk. There is some code in it, but not a whole lot. And it's not really a dive into the manual or documentation for PHP. It's not sort of 10 cool things you can do like destructuring arrays or anything like that. I was asked to give this talk at a software development group a couple of years ago, who were just a generic sort of agnostic software group who wanted to talk on PHP and what it was. So first of all, we have elephants, as we've seen. We have a nice sort of PHP Yorkshire one here. There's a variety of colours. We all like collecting and buying and trading elephants. And I bought one from the PHP South Wales stash that I've bought that we can raffle off or give away at the end. So maybe that can be our joined-in prize for the evening. So according to the php.net website, which is the main website where all the documentation and all the API documentation lives, PHP is a popular general-purpose scripting language that is especially suited for web development and web applications. It's fast, flexible, pragmatic. PHP powers everything from your blog to the most popular sites in the world. And this is what I'm hoping to come across with this talk, is to talk sort of the flexibility of it, and we can really use it for different things based on what your needs are. So PHP, when it's first coined, it started for personal homepage. Now it stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, which I believe is called a recursive acronym because the first P stands for PHP. I sort of prefer the first one, to be honest, but there we are. But if anybody asks what PHP stands for, that's the right answer. Here are the versions that we currently have on the PHP website. You can see that we're currently using 8.0 and 8.1. They're the current active supported versions. 7.4 is in security release only. And something for me, I've been doing PHP since about 2007, I think, 2007. So these were back in, I think, the PHP 5.2 days. Things were really sort of slow at that point. Something that's been quite interesting for me that I've noticed is things have really sped up the last couple of years. 6 got skipped, we won't talk about that. Then we started going through the 7 releases, adding lots of new features into the language, and then 8's come out again, and now 8.1 is coming out. That's really sort of sped up over the last couple of years. 5 is completely gone, at least as far as PHP documentation is concerned. So I re-screenshotted this today. You can see where we are in terms of the support thing there. So this is from a site called w3text.com. I'm not sure how accurate they are or how up-to-date they are, but it's a good sort of metric, even to have a look at things like most popular server-side programming languages. So in this case, PHP is right at the top. So 77% of every site or application that they can figure out what it is done with PHP. ASP is down in second with 7.9. So there's quite a big difference. You know, PHP is the real sort of big, I don't want to say maybe not dominant, but the main server-side language to pick. So when you're looking at job postings or looking to get into the industry like I was doing back in 2007, I'm looking at stats like this to try and figure out which might be the right sort of ones to go for. This slide is from the same site. This is looking at content management system popularity. And we can see WordPress right there at the top, which is written in PHP. Shopify, Wix, and Squarespace. These are new ones that have come in between me giving the talk last time and now. But we can then see Joomla and Drupal down there. Again, these are sort of PHP frameworks. So out of the top 6 CMSs there. 3 of them are built on PHP, which is really good. Again, WordPress being the major one in that metric. Interestingly, the other 3 are all sort of Shopify and Wix are sort of software as a service or sort of build it yourself online types of things. So they weren't really there when I did this talk last time. Before it was WordPress, Joomla, Drupal in the top 3. So that's quite interesting maybe as well. Okay, how do we get started with PHP? First of all, you want to check what version of PHP you have. It's usually installed on pretty much all the operating systems, I think, at this point. Or if you install it yourself, you can run this command and just figure out which version you're running. So you run php-v and you'll get something a bit like this. Again, you can see I've updated this one recently. This is running at PHP 8.1.0. This is the command line version of PHP and the date it was built, etc., etc. But we know from this we're running PHP 8.1. How do we then get started writing some PHP? Well, we can open up a text editor. I like Vim, but that's a completely other talk. And in there we can start writing our PHP code. So our first file, as you see on line 1 here, we've got our opening tag, just with our left angle bracket $PHP. That's our opening tag, and everything after this is PHP. We can have a closing tag, but it's usually not recommended or outright discouraged if you're doing things like particularly around frameworks or CMSs. But I don't think you actually need to put it in there. And the convention would say, if it's particularly a web app, it's going to be called index.php. So that's the main file that's going to get loaded. So we'll use that. And then we can just echo out some things like hello world. And we're just going to output a string, hello world. And then we can run it. So you can say PHP, file name, and that's what we're going to execute. And just runs it in our command line. If it's web app, then we can use PHP's built-in web server, which is great. We can just say PHP-S and then a URL that we want to host it on, and it will spin up a local web server based on the version of PHP we've got running. It's fairly limited, so you can't switch versions really, and it's only HTTP traffic, I still believe. So, but it's great for like local development and things. So it's not meant for production, but great for developing on locally if you need to. And then we'll start seeing something like this. So I've said run it on port 8000, and it's just saying our web development server started on the port that I told it to, essentially. And then we can just go to that in the browser, localhost 8000, and there's our lovely, fully built, working PHP application. If you like Docker, I'm quite a big Docker fan. There are a set of official containers, as far as Docker is concerned, official containers that we can use to run and test our applications in. So we could just say Docker run, pass through a volume where our code is into our container. We can say it's PHP 8.1, again in this case. It's command line interface, CLI, and then running on Alpine Linux. And again, we can just say run index.php. So this will run the same file, but we know this time it's going to be run in PHP 8.1. If we want to test it in a different version of PHP, we just change the version number. So we can run it in 7.4 now instead of 8.1. So this is great if we're working on like an open source library. We have to support multiple versions of things in your sort of work or projects. You're probably not going to do this very often, but for open source, this is really good. Just be able to test things. So if I'm running an application right now in 7.4, I want to test it at 8.1, I can just switch out the version number in my container, and it will change it. I can test it. I don't need to worry about having multiple versions of PHP installed, because that's a bit tricky. Alternatively, if it's a web app, again, we can use a slightly different container. We can still use 8.1 here, but we can use the Apache tag, and we can just mount our file to a different file into var www.html now. We can mount a port, so we can go from port 80 inside the container to port 80 on the local host, and that will just run our app in the same way that we saw before. So again, I typically wouldn't use the PHP Apache container. I'd use something else, but again, for local development, it's fine. Okay, so a little bit of some code now. This is our first example app, and we can just make a function. We can have a function called say. A really weird angle here. I'm not quite sure where's the best place to stand. There we go. So we can make a function called say, and it's just a global function just in a file, we just include that we're going to run. And same as we saw before, we're just going to say echo hello together. So we can expand on this. We can use variables. So we can pass in a variable to our function now, it's called value, and then we can echo out the value of our variable rather than hard coding it in. And then something we can do, most of some of the recent versions as well, is pass through, we can say, by adding these type hints here, what type of values that they need to be. So we can say that the value needs to be a string, so we can only accept a string. If it's not a string, we'll throw a type error. And then in this case as well, nothing is returned, we're just echoing something out. So that return type on the end here is void, it doesn't return anything at all. So this is something that we've been able to do since PHP 7 something, as we can now use type hints for things like strings, which we couldn't do since previous versions, as we could only do things like arrays and standard objects. And there's some preference here, like you personally might really like type hints or return types, or you might not. Certain frameworks have certain preferences around this as well. I quite like it personally myself, but there we are. I remember working some of my earlier jobs, and that every function we have to say, is this value an array, or do something, is this value a boolean? And we do all this normalization over and over again. It's like every function used to drive me crazy. And I used to be like, there must be a better way, and this is why I really like strict typing, I think, now. If we wanted to not echo out our string and we wanted to return it, we change our return type. So we're going to accept in a string, we're going to return back a string, and our echo is changed to a return. So we can call this method somewhere else and then use the value of it rather than just echoing out. So a little bit of code. And PHP also has support for classes and object-oriented code. So we can make a class called a person, and a person will say something, and we can just move that function for what was just a global function inside a file into a class. It's called a method now because it's inside a class, but they do the same thing. Methods can be public or protected or private, it depends. This one we can call from outside of our person, so it's public. But essentially it does the same thing. So version 1, let's have a global function. We just say brackets, semicolon, output, hello world. Version 2, we have string as the argument, so we can pass that into our function as an argument. It will come back out again. And then version 3, we have to new up our person object. So we say the person is a new person, and then the person then says something. So several different ways of doing the same type of thing. The PHP gives us this flexibility, right? So we can do complicated, or this is a simple example, but we can do complicated classes and object-oriented code, or we can do really simple things. We can do strict typing, or we can do duck typing. So we don't put type hints in, but if we know what it accepts, so we'll go with it. Okay, so talked a little bit about PHP and what it can do. How do we then build on that now? So we can level up and we can look at some content management systems. So there's a couple of lists coming up. They're not exhaustive lists, there's other options, I'm sure. They've changed since the last time I did this talk a few years ago. Some of them are just based on my experience and my preference, but there's going to be others, right? I'm not saying if I'm not including it, it's not that it's bad and it's not good because I've put it in, and I'm not comparing one to the other. But yeah, so there's asterisk here. So Drupal is a content management system that I'm most familiar with. I've been using it since about 2010, I think, full time, about 2007 as a hobbyist and a freelancer. So I've got a lot of experience with Drupal, and content management systems in general are just systems for managing content. So you install this on your web server, and this will need a database to connect to. So Drupal itself is written in PHP. It will connect to a database. Your database stores all your content in it, and then it's also responsible for outputting that content and doing things with it. So I like Drupal. I use it most of the time. You can build quite a complex content architecture in it with different content types and different block types. You can use tools in it for building pages, like lists of news articles and things were built in. You can output stuff with an API, for example, as well. So that's my preference, so, or at least the one I work with the most. WordPress we saw earlier on in some of the other slides. So WordPress is super popular. I think it's about 40% of the web or something at this point. Is a lot of sites are running on WordPress. So yeah, it's great. I've used it for some time. I used it a little while ago. But yeah, not recently, so I haven't really kept up to date with a lot of the developments in the WordPress community, but not since I went to the WordCamp they did here in Bristol anyway. Joomla's another one. Again, I've not used this one for some time, so I can't really speak in depth about it. But these were sort of the big three PHP-based CMSs. And when I got started doing PHP, I got asked to build a website for somebody, and then I was like, okay, I can build it in HTML, and then I can bolt on a photo gallery or whatever I did at the time, and then started to look at how do I start making things dynamic. So I started to look into using PHP and then MySQL as a database, and then I've got a screenshot of it somewhere, of a forum post where I said, well, how do I do this? And someone said, well, check out these content management systems, and Drupal was one, and WordPress was one, and Joomla was one, I think. I pretty much built the same site over and over again, 3 or 4 different times, in different CMSs to sort of see how they went. So they're sort of the big three, at least as far as I'm, in my mind anyway. Type of 3 is another one that I've come across quite recently. I've not used it, but I know some people who sort of work there, so quite interested in it for an option. And another one that I came across was Perch. I think we've had someone give a talk on Perch a little while ago, so yeah, it's quite interesting. But they're all sort of geared around, like Drupal is probably for bigger or more complex sites, possibly, but not always, and Perch is maybe sort of for smaller sites. So it really depends on what type of project you're building, maybe it depends on what sort of thing you're going to use, possibly. Some of it's preference as well, I guess, but there we go. So the other thing we'll talk about is frameworks. So Symfony is a framework. Out of the frameworks, I probably prefer Symfony. Symfony is used, or parts of it, used by Drupal and other projects, but we'll get into that later on. But Symfony itself, at least for this slide, is concerned, as far as this slide is concerned, is just a framework that we can download and start using as a sort of base for a starting point for our own code base. And they intend to sort of fix common problems with their own code, similar to the way the CMSs do, I guess. There's also Laravel, which is another really popular PHP framework. Part of it's built on Symfony, as it was originally. And this screenshot is probably quite out of date. Some of them are. I updated some of them, but not all of them. So if you look at this, I think this one definitely is out of date, but there we are. Let's see. And then Laminas is the other one. So this used to be called Zen Framework, and then it sort of got bought out or renamed or something happened. But yes, Laminas is the enterprise-ready PHP framework. So we could use a CMS if we want to manage content. We could use a framework if we don't need to use a framework. But what if we only need to have a static site? So PHP also has things called static site generators, as do some other languages. And then my personal site falls into this category as well. So I don't need a full CMS, and I don't need to have a big database, and I want things to run as quickly as possible and run them on the server. So static site generators are tools that take in one thing, so potentially sort of Markdown typically, if you're used to writing GitHub tickets or things in Markdown language. So you might write blog posts in Markdown, you might write some HTML to begin with. Sculpin uses some of the Symfony components that I mentioned, so it uses a templating language called Twig. You can use that as well. Build up your pages with these things, run it through a site generator. It will then essentially compile your website for you, and then you end up with a static site, a generated static site. So you can just take those files and put them onto a web server and serve them. So no need for a database or anything, which is great. So this one's pretty much, as I said, built on some of the Symfony components. So it's very, sort of speaks to me quite well as a Drupal Symfony person, because a lot of the components are the same. Templating is the same, for example. Jigsaw is one run by or maintained by a company called Titan. So this is based more on the Laravel components. So if you're doing a Laravel framework project, you might want to look at using Jigsaw for a static site. Again, it uses the same blade templating syntax in its template. So yeah, you can see a screenshot of this down here. So if you're familiar with Laravel, Jigsaw might be a good option as well. Okay, code reuse and collaboration. So this was quite a big thing. speaking from experience, back in the early, well for me, early Drupal days, everything inside Drupal itself was written by Drupal developers and the core team and the maintainers. There was no, with the exception of jQuery, I think was probably the only one, everything was written internally. And part of that was because I think of security concerns. There was an earlier issue, and anyway, I think that's what the reason was. But the newer versions, as of Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 and other projects, use parts of other projects in them. So I'm picking on Symfony again here. But we can see on their webpage projects that use Symfony. So we can see Drupal there, we can see Joomla there. We saw that earlier. Magento is a big e-commerce platform built on PHP and built on Symfony. Silius is another one. So there's lots of these projects built on top of other projects, or at least parts of them. The main reason for this is a tool called Composer, and Composer is PHP's package manager, or PHP's dependency manager. And until this came along, there wasn't really a way of sharing code or reusing code. There were sites like phpclasses.com or something like that you could go onto. See his face in the back there. You could just go, and someone would make like, here's a class that I wrote, copy paste into your project. And Stack Overflow was probably the other sort of main one at that point. But the nice thing about using tools like Composer is we can actually go in and say, I want to require this part of this library and include it with mine. So we'll see an example of that in a second. Composer works with a website called Packagist. So this is the repository where on the website we can find all these packages. This is very similar to if you're using npm or yarn or pip or one of those types of things, just for PHP, obviously. So we can go on this website. So say if we're building a command line application, then we might want to use the Symfony console component. So it's available on Packagist, and you can also find it on GitHub. You can see, let's see that there's the GitHub details over here. You can find it. And there's a little command here. So Composer requires Symfony-console. Most of the time they match the URLs. You can just copy paste them, but not always. Most of the time. So assuming I've got Composer installed on my machine, I can then run Composer require something, package name. So it's inside the Symfony namespace, and then it's the console component. And this will download that package, put it into a directory called vendor, and it's available now for me to use in my project. So we have a file that's called composer.json. So it's a JSON file with all of our dependencies in. This is in a require section because we are requiring it. If it was a development-only dependency, to make a testing framework, you'd have a required dev section. There's other things in here as well, but this is the main point of this slide. And at the top of our file, we can include this line. So as I said, everything we're pulling in through Composer usually goes into a vendor directory, and there's this file that gets generated called autoload.php. So once we include that, we have access to all the things that we've required. So for example, we can then say, make a new application, which is our Symfony component console application. So the application is the PHP class name, and it's inside these directories, inside this namespace. So it's not our application, it's the Symfony console application. And then we can just say run, app run. And that will run it. Alternatively, we can use a use statement here. We can import it to make our line 7 here a little bit cleaner and just move everything up to a use. So this is similar to sort of like an import, I guess. If you're doing something in JavaScript, you can import a package and then use it lower down. We can do the same type of thing here. Yeah, that's essentially how we can pull in third-party components into our project and reuse them. And you could do the same thing, like this is using an open source example that's available on GitHub. This could be your own project. You could make your own project and reuse that across your other projects as well. So I do this with some of my things. I've got a couple of private libraries and packages that I tend to reuse. And I just reuse them in my own projects rather than just copying and pasting them every time. And I can maintain one central version and then update them, push that to the central version, and then update all my projects based on that rather than copying and pasting everything. So there's a whole list of them, as well as on the Symfony, the packages site. We can look at Symfony components. There's a whole list of them. They're always adding more. Again, I'm just highlighting Symfony itself, but Laravel has its own set of packages as well. They're under the Illuminate namespace. So I Composer require Illuminate collections a lot. Big fan of collections library. I've got some of my own public packages and libraries as well, so I can compose require OP Davis / something, I can't remember. But yeah, it doesn't need to be Symfony components. They could be anything that's on Packagist via GitHub or anything else. The other sort of party to mention here is PHP Fake, which was originally called the, let's get this right, PHP Framework Interoperability Group, which I notice has now been shortened to Interop Group, I guess, because people couldn't pronounce it properly. They're sort of the group that are responsible for creating what's called PSRs. So these are standards within the PHP community, and some of them are things like coding styles and I think some of the other ones now, like container interfaces and something else. I'm not kept up to date with some of the earlier ones, but some of the earlier ones are quite interesting. But yeah, haven't kept up with them all. But the idea here is if there's a standard around, let's say, a container, and there's one standard container interface, Symfony's container can be compatible with it, and Laravel's can be compatible with it, and you could swap them in and out of your project because they all follow the similar contract, and you can just swap them in and out because you can say, get and set on it, and we know they both got get and set because they implement the same standard PSR. So anyway, so tools. We mentioned Composer already, but it is a really big part of the ecosystem these days. Lots of projects have gone to using Composer by default for their setup, like Drupal being one of them. We used to get plugins by downloading zip files and putting them into your directory, or using Drupal's sort of own tools, and WordPress as a WordPress CLI, which I think does something similar. Like Composer is sort of the de facto tool for doing that now. It's not just dependency management. We touched on like auto loading and other things as well. It does quite a lot of other stuff as well if you want to. Xdebug is the debugging extension. So you can install this and do something like this. So inside an IDE or a text editor, you can put breakpoints in. Step debugging, that's the word I was trying to find. Sorry, step debugging. So you can put breakpoints here on like line 115. So we've got a little breakpoint here. And when we're running the code, because we've got a breakpoint and Xdebug is running, it will stop the code at that point. We can inspect it, and we can see like on here, like there's the variables that we're sort of looking at that are in scope at this particular point. We can see the stack trace here of all the things that have run in this request, and I can sort of figure out where everything is. And I can see here all the variables that we've got. So this is really good for debugging, hence Xdebug, I guess. But rather than doing like a var dump or a DD and stopping it that way, this is really good. You can stop it at a certain point, have it continue, and you can change things inside these little areas and make them work. It's a really, really good tool to look at using. I think Derek's going to talk here about it before. PHP Unit is sort of the de facto testing framework in PHP at the moment, anyway. So it's using most of the, like Symfony will use it, and Drupal will use it, Laravel uses it by default. It is really the de facto one at the moment. The new kid on the block, I guess, is Pest. Maybe not that new anymore, maybe. But yeah, this is the same thing. It's actually built on top of PHP Unit, so it's a slightly different way of writing tests and a slightly different output. But we'll see an example of that now. So this is a PHP Unit based test. So let's say we've got an email value object. We can make a test case called email test here. So every test case needs to end with the word test in it for it to be recognized, and it needs to extend a test case. And also our testing need to start with the word test as well, usually. We could say here, so we get a test that we're able to create one of our email objects from a string. Essentially, it's a really sort of fairly simple example for a test, but it gets the point across. And we can say here, we're going to assert, so we can make an email from this string, and we're just asserting that what we get back matches this class. It's one of our email classes. It doesn't really, essentially, can we construct a class? Whether I'd write a test like this is debatable, maybe. So by contrast, this is sort of a pest version of how you do the same thing. If anybody's written sort of JavaScript-based tests with Jest, then it's very similar. You get this sort of it or should syntax at the beginning, or test keyword at the beginning, a label, and then a function, and what they call the expectation API. You can say expect something to be an instance of, and you can start chaining them and do some really quite cool things. I've played with both. I quite like both. Yeah. Something interesting has come up the Laravel framework, or one of the Laravel maintainers has written it. It's really good. It seems to get a lot of traction right now. BCAT is sort of similar, but rather than being unit testing, this is based on behavioral testing and behavioral-driven, so BDD rather than TDD, behavioral-driven development rather than test-driven development. You can see these sort of golden words here. PHP framework for order to test your business expectations. So this is pretty much based on, rather than writing code sort of like this, where we're saying, like, here's lots of PHP code, BHAT tests are written in a language called Gherkin, which isn't PHP specific either, but it's sort of a PHP implementation of it. And this is an example from their docs, but it's all written in a very business style format. So if you're used to working with user stories, like given there is a user with this name and when this happens, then I can do this, etc. You write them out in this way, and then there is PHP code behind it that does the things, but you're writing them in this very business-focused way. And the idea is then you've got stakeholders or project managers or business analysts or somebody to even sit down and write the stories with you, rather than sort of writing the tests out yourself, I guess. PHP Stan, so if people here last month who saw Peter's talk on PHP Stan, there's another one called SAM, which is very similar. They're both static analysis tools. So they're tools that you can run in the command line that will run type checking as, well, typically are runtime checks. So things that would error when you actually run the file in the browser or in the command line, it will run them in its own command line. That's a really bad example. And highlight those errors for you in advance of you having to actually run it in a more production environment, as well as doing things like undeclared variables and other things that you can use. So there's actually a really good example of this on their homepage that you can see what it does, but I'd recommend take a look at Peter's talk about this as well from last month. Okay. So we'll talk a little about learning. So I'm a self-taught developer, so I learned a lot from online resources, sites like Drupalize Me for Drupal training, Symfony Casts for Symfony screencasts, and then Laracasts as well for Laravel screencasts. So there's lots of different, as well as like, there's a lot on YouTube, there's a lot on Twitch as well, but these are really dedicated sites for training in those sort of areas. And CodeCourse is another one that I quite like. It's, again, a lot of Laravel, PHP, Alpine, Vue.js type content. But yeah, again, a lot of really good stuff. And then once you've done all this training, there are certifications available. So Zend, as in the company, not the framework, do a PHP certification still on the actual language itself. You'll be a PHP certified engineer. Acquia has its own certification program around Drupal. So Acquia is like the main for-profit company behind Drupal project. And then Symfony has its own certification as well on Symfony framework and on things like Twig templating as well. And then just to wrap up, I guess, the community. So PHP Southwest, we're all here at Southwest today, which is great. So obviously we're aware that these sorts of events go on and happen because we're at one. But there are lots of others as well. So I run the one currently now in South Wales, but I've been to a lot of other ones. As I've travelled for work, it's like London and Manchester and places, there's groups in those places as well. So I try and make a point of dropping in and going and see what's going on there. And as well as the sort of small monthly meetups, then there are big conferences that happen. So PHP UK is sort of the main UK one at this point, as well as lots of other events sort of everywhere. So think of every one of those, there's something going on, whether it's a meetup or a conference or something. I think for me, it's like that's been one of the main things throughout COVID, and everything has pretty much gone, obviously we've not been able to do in-person meetups until quite recently, but everything has gone online. So being able to go and run meetups on Zoom or join meetups and do talks for conferences in America and Ukraine and other sort of places like that, met a lot of people I wouldn't have got to meet otherwise, which has been great. So just to sort of recap, I guess, really, things about PHP, it's very easy to get started, just with global functions in the file if you want, and then you can iterate and make them into classes and do what you need to do. Large choice of tools and frameworks, so content management systems, frameworks, static analysis tools, testing tools, all these things that we can go ahead and use in our projects if we need to. A great community, so again, we know this from being at a meetup, but whenever I'm stuck on a problem, what used to be IRC, I guess, back in the day, but now there's like the PHP Southwest Slack, or there's the South Wales Slack, or there's a PHP user group Slack. There's all these people you can go and ask questions of, and chances are someone has seen this or solved it in a package that they've done before. A lot of great learning resources, like Laracast, SymphonyCasts, Drupalize Me, and a lot of PHP open source projects, so things like Symfony, Drupal, Laravel, just little libraries, a lot of them hosted on GitHub for the most part. So if you're using something, I wish it did this, or maybe you found a bug or something, there's an opportunity there as well to contribute back to these projects and get your little sort of avatar on the thing. And that's a really good thing. You put like on a CV or in a project or something, like I've contributed to, insert project name here. And that's really invaluable. But yeah, that's a completely other talk again as well. So yeah, there's this page I'll put up, things about PHP. I'll just put all the links from this talk, I'll put them there, along with a couple of others. There's things like some podcasts like Voice of the Elephant and PHP Roundtable and PHP Ugly. So there's a few other things I thought of whilst I was putting this together. I'll put them all there, and yeah, there's my site as well, where there's a lot of blog posts and other things around there, and that's where the slides that this will be as well afterwards. So, do you have time for questions, Lee? Or okay, great. Anybody have questions? Mm-hmm.
So you were talking at the beginning about usage statistics.
Yeah.
I've done PHP for quite a long time, and I've always wondered, is the usage of PHP going up or down relative to other things? Because the reason why PHP got popular is because there was nothing like it at the time, just back in the day. But now there are lots of things like Node and stuff like that. Yeah. So do we know, is it obviously it's still very active, but is usage of it going up or down?
That's a good question. Is usage of it going up or down? Yeah. I do see every so often I see posts like on Twitter or Reddit like PHP is dead, and I'm like, well, obviously it's not, right? Because it's still going. So there's that sort of very sort of extreme sort of view part of it. Like we're definitely seeing things like going up. Like there's like the Laravel one, I think. I want to say 4 million downloads a month or something they had recently, some really big number. And it's definitely, so that is probably a good metric for these things sort of still going up, or he's getting more usage or more rollouts. And yeah, listening to some people talk about, like sort of the Laravel one in particular, we were going to move to Ruby on Rails or something, whatever the project was going to be, and then Laravel came along and we started using it. So there are things like that, but I guess part of it as well is the types of projects you're probably using it on.
Yeah, very much depends on how you measure.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like I do wonder about this, like WordPress being like really popular, like using lots of sites, but there are probably lots of really small sites. Whereas to draw a comparison, like Drupal's really big in really large sites, particularly around like local government, for example, and higher educational things. So it's maybe not as much about how many installs it has, but how big are the projects that are using it. So that's probably, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. For sure, but no, I've been really impressed with some of the new things that have gone to PHP 8.1 and 8 and 8.1, for example. So it definitely makes my life a lot easier for some of those things. So hopefully we can keep iterating on some of these things going forward as well. So
we will keep turning up some of these episodes.
Yeah, definitely. I'll still be here anyway. Cool. Anybody else have any questions? Or nope. Okay. Cool. Thanks very much.